For thousands of years, people wondered what happened to the Sumerians after their civilization fell. Did they vanish into history? Did their bloodline disappear? Well, scientists finally tested their actual DNA, and the results prove something incredible. They never left. They're still here. But before we reveal what researchers discovered, if you're fascinated by hidden connections in ancient history, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This story changes everything we thought we knew about one of humanity's greatest civilizations. The Sumerians built the world's first real cities. They invented writing. They created complex government systems, legal codes, and trade networks that influenced every civilization that came after them. They called themselves the Black-Headed People, and they dominated southern Mesopotamia for over 2,000 years. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu weren't just settlements. They were centers of learning, power, and culture. At its peak, around 2900 BCE, the city of Uruk alone held between 50,000 and 80,000 people living within 6 miles of defensive walls. That made it the largest city on Earth at the time. No other place came close. The Sumerians achieved things that seemed impossible for the ancient world. They built monumental architecture, created sophisticated irrigation systems that transformed marshlands into farmland, and developed mathematics advanced enough to influence how we measure time today. Their base 60 numeral system is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds. Think about what Sumerian innovation meant for the world. Around 3200 BCE, in the city of Uruk, someone picked up a reed stylus and pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. Those marks represented sounds, ideas, and concepts. That was the birth of cuneiform writing, the oldest known writing system on Earth. Before cuneiform, humans had used symbols and pictures to represent things, but nothing like this. Nothing so systematic, so capable of recording complex ideas with precision. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest literary works, was recorded in cuneiform. It tells the story of a Sumerian king who lived around 2700 BCE in his quest for immortality. That poem is older than the Bible. It influenced Greek and Roman myths. It shaped how humans thought about heroism, friendship, and mortality. And it was written down by Sumerians, using a system they invented in a language they spoke. The Sumerians didn't just create a civilization. They created the framework for all civilizations that followed. Their cities operated on principles that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. Each Sumerian city-state had its own patron deity, its own temple complex, and its own ruler. Uruk worshipped Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Ur worshipped Nanna, the moon god. Eridu, believed to be the oldest Sumerian city, centered around the temple of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. These weren't just religious buildings. In the temples were administrative centers. They stored grain during good harvests to distribute during bad ones. They organized labor for major construction projects. They maintained records of taxes and trade. Priests and priestesses held real political power. They managed the city's wealth, organized public works, and settled disputes. By around 2900 BCE, a new kind of leader had emerged. The Sumerians called them Lugal, meaning strong man. These were military commanders and administrators who wielded secular power alongside the religious authority of the priesthood. This split between religious and secular power would become a model repeated throughout human civilization. But then something changed. By around 2000 BCE, Sumerian political power began to fade. The collapse of the third dynasty of Ur marked the beginning of the end for Sumerian dominance. The great kingdoms that had ruled for centuries crumbled. The cities that once dominated Mesopotamia fell under control of other groups. The Akkadians, who spoke a different language, gradually replaced Sumerian as the region's primary tongue. Amorites from the west and Elamites from the east pressed into Mesopotamia, destabilizing the political structures that had governed it. The irrigation systems that had made Mesopotamian agriculture so productive began to fail. Climate change, particularly increased salinity in the soil and shifting river patterns, made farming more difficult. Population pressure from neighboring regions increased. Within a few centuries, Sumerian civilization as a distinct political force essentially disappeared from history books. The great ziggurats stood abandoned. The cities that had housed tens of thousands fell into decay. The language that had created cuneiform writing was no longer spoken as a mother tongue. From the perspective of historical records, Sumer had vanished. For scholars studying the ancient world, this raised an enormous question that lingered for centuries. When a civilization fell and its power vanished, what happened to the people? Did they migrate away? Were they absorbed into other populations? Did their genetic line simply vanish, wiped out, and replaced? Did invaders completely replace the native population? It was assumed by many historians that conquest typically meant replacement. When the Akkadians conquered Sumerian cities, perhaps they killed many of the Sumerians and brought in their own people to settle the land. When Elamites and Amorites invaded, maybe the Sumerians fled to distant lands. Archaeologists could study ruins and artifacts. Historians could read ancient texts written on clay tablets. but they had no way to trace the actual bloodline of the Sumerians themselves. They couldn't answer the question directly. That changed when modern DNA science emerged. In 2011, a team of international geneticists published a landmark study in BMC, Ecology and Evolution. They wanted to answer one specific question. Could they find the genetic descendants of ancient Sumerians alive today? To do this, they traveled to southern Iraq, to the marshlands where Sumer once thrived. There, they met the Marsh Arabs, a population that had lived in those same wetlands for thousands of years. Historians and archaeologists had long suspected that the Marsh Arabs might carry the bloodline of the ancient Sumerians. These modern people practiced lifestyles remarkably similar to what ancient texts described. They lived in reed houses built the same way Sumerians had built them millennia before. They fished in the marshes using traditional methods that echoed ancient practices. They maintained customs and traditions that seemed to belong to a much older world. But was this connection real? Was it cultural memory, or was it genetic continuity? The research team, led by geneticist Nadia Al-Zahari and her colleagues from the University of Pavia in Italy, decided to find out. They collected DNA samples from 143 Marsh Arabs living in southern Iraq and compared them against a large sample of Iraqi controls. They examined two specific types of genetic markers that could trace paternal and maternal ancestry: Y chromosome variation, which tracks the male lineage passed from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, which tracks the maternal line passed from mother to child. Before understanding what they found, it's important to know how this genetic analysis works. Every person inherits a Y chromosome from their father, if they're male, passed down through the male line essentially unchanged for generations. This creates a trail of genetic markers that can be traced through time. Scientists can look at these markers and identify haplogroups, which are groups of similar Y chromosomes that share a common ancestor. Similarly, mitochondrial DNA is inherited from mothers and passes down through the female line. By examining both of these genetic systems, researchers can trace both paternal and maternal ancestry separately, building a complete picture of a population's genetic heritage. What they found was remarkable. The Marsh Arabs showed a prevalent Middle Eastern genetic component in both their male and female gene pools. This meant their ancestors had deep roots in Mesopotamia, not in distant lands. More importantly, when researchers looked at specific genetic haplogroups, they found direct evidence of genetic continuity with the Sumerian period. Haplogroup J1, the most common Y chromosome lineage in the Middle East, appeared frequently in the Marsh Arab population. But it wasn't just the presence of this haplogroup. The specific subgroups and their distribution patterns told a story about when and how populations had changed. The key discovery came from examining the Y chromosome data. Among the Marsh Arabs, geneticists identified a particular genetic marker called the J1 page 08 branch. This wasn't just present in their DNA, it showed signs of a local population expansion, a moment in time when this genetic line had dramatically increased in frequency within the population. Researchers calculated when this expansion occurred using molecular dating techniques. The results were stunning. This genetic expansion happened approximately 4,000 years ago, almost exactly contemporary with the Sumerian city-state period that characterized southern Mesopotamia. That was no coincidence. Between roughly 2900 and 2350 BCE, Sumerian city-states dominated the region. Kings ruled from cities like Lagash, Uruk, and Eridu. This was the height of Sumerian power and influence, and the DNA evidence showed that this was precisely when the J1 page 08 genetic lineage had experienced its major population expansion among the ancestors of modern Marsh Arabs. The research team also found older genetic signals within the Marsh Arab population. Another Y chromosome lineage called J1M267 star showed evidence of more ancient ancestry shared with northern Mesopotamia. This suggested that the genetic history of the region was layered. Some ancestors came from northern areas, and their genetic traces remained visible in modern populations. But the more dominant signal, the one that showed dramatic recent expansion, aligned perfectly with the Sumerian era. The implications were clear. The Marsh Arabs of Iraq carried genetic ancestry directly traceable to the Sumerian period. They weren't just culturally connected to Sumerians through shared traditions. They were biologically connected. The DNA didn't lie. But the researchers wanted to understand something even deeper. Throughout history, populations had migrated into Mesopotamia. Agricultural techniques had been introduced from distant lands. People brought new crops, new animals, and new ways of life. Water buffalo had been domesticated and introduced from the Indian subcontinent. Rice farming had arrived from far away. If the Sumerians had intermarried with all these incoming populations, how much would their original genetic signature have been diluted or replaced? The research provided an answer. When geneticists examined the contribution of these foreign populations to the Marsh Arab gene pool, they found something surprising. The introduction of water buffalo breeding and rice farming from The Indian subcontinent, practices that had clearly arrived in Mesopotamia from outside, had only marginally affected the gene pool of the local population. This meant that, despite thousands of years of cultural exchange and migration, the core genetic ancestry of the region remained remarkably continuous. The Sumerians hadn't been replaced, they had persisted. Based on all this evidence, the research team reached a significant conclusion. The modern marsh Arabs of Iraq harbored genetic signatures in both mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes that were predominantly of Mesopotamian origin. If the marsh Arabs were indeed descendants of the ancient Sumerians, then the Sumerians themselves were most likely native to Mesopotamia, not invaders from distant lands. They were autochthonous, meaning they had developed in place. This challenged certain theories that had suggested the Sumerians might have migrated from far-flung origins, perhaps from the Caucasus, or from the Arabian Peninsula, or from Central Asia. Some scholars had speculated about exotic origins for the Sumerians because their language seemed unique, not clearly belonging to the major language families surrounding Mesopotamia. This uniqueness had led to theories about where they came from. The DNA evidence pointed to something different. The Sumerians were rooted in Mesopotamia itself. They emerged from the land, built their civilization there, and their descendants still lived in that region thousands of years later. This also meant something else. Over thousands of years, despite invasions and changes in language and religion, the core genetic ancestry of the region had remained relatively continuous. The introduction of new groups from outside brought their genes into the mix, but they didn't replace the existing population entirely. Instead, there was mixing and integration. Over generations, the populations blended together. The marsh Arabs of today represented the result of this long process of mixing and adaptation. They carried the genetic legacy of their Sumerian ancestors, mixed with the genetic contributions of Akkadians and other groups that had come later. But the Sumerian signal remained detectable, identifiable, unmistakable. What made this discovery even more powerful was how the researchers interpreted it. One of the most profound assumptions in historical scholarship had been this. When a civilization disappeared from written records, when its political power faded and its cities fell into decline, the people themselves had essentially vanished. They were replaced by conquering populations or absorbed so completely that they left no trace. The Sumerian DNA study challenged this assumption fundamentally. Civilizations could fall, kingdoms could crumble, but the people endured. They adapted. They mixed with newcomers, but they didn't disappear. The genetic thread remained unbroken. For 4,000 years, through invasions and migrations and cultural transformations, the descendants of the Sumerians had continued to live in Mesopotamia. They had changed, certainly. They had adopted new languages, new religions, new ways of organizing society. But genetically, they persisted. The blood of the Sumerians who built Uruk and Ur still flowed through modern populations in Iraq. This single study opened up enormous questions about how we understand ancient history. If the Sumerians hadn't vanished, what did that mean for other civilizations we thought had disappeared? What did it mean for understanding the true depth of human continuity in ancient regions? How many other populations, we wondered, had survived their civilization's collapse in ways that modern DNA science was only now revealing? The question was no longer whether ancient peoples had survived their civilization's falls. The question had become, how did they survive? And what did their survival tell us about human resilience and adaptation? A decade later, in 2022, Harvard University's prestigious genetics research program, led by Yosef Lazaridis and David Reich from Harvard Medical School, published groundbreaking research in the journal Science. This study, conducted by an international team of researchers, provided the first ever ancient DNA data extracted directly from pre-pottery Neolithic Mesopotamia. They didn't just study modern populations like the marsh Arabs. They went back in time, analyzing the actual genetic material of people who had lived in Mesopotamia during the very earliest periods of human settlement and early farming. They extracted DNA from skeletal remains found at archaeological sites in southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and the Zagros Mountains. They examined individuals who had lived between approximately 8,000 and 6,500 BCE, thousands of years before the Sumerians themselves rose to prominence. What they discovered was a complex tapestry of population movements and genetic mixing. The earliest populations in Mesopotamia showed evidence of admixture from multiple sources. There were genetic connections to Anatolian hunter-gatherers, to Caucasus populations, and to Levantine populations from the broader region. Different populations had moved into Mesopotamia at different times, bringing their genetic ancestry with them. These ancient people mixed together, creating what researchers called a Neolithic continuum of ancestry. This ancestry mirrored the geography of West Asia, suggesting that genetic patterns followed the landscape and the routes people traveled. The study also documented two distinct waves of migration. Before pottery was invented, one group of farmers with predominantly Mesopotamian ancestry migrated into Anatolia. Later, after pottery, appeared in the archaeological record, another wave of farmers moved into the same region, these ones carrying both Mesopotamian and Levantine genetic ancestry. This showed that Mesopotamia wasn't isolated. It was a crossroads where populations mixed and moved, yet maintained distinct genetic signatures. What did all of this mean when combined with the earlier findings about the Marsh Arabs? It meant that genetic ancestry in Mesopotamia had a long history, going back thousands of years before the Sumerians themselves emerged as an identifiable civilization. When the Sumerians did appear in the historical record around 4000 BCE, they were building upon populations that had already lived in Mesopotamia for thousands of years. The early Sumerians themselves may have mixed with these earlier populations. As Sumerian civilization developed and flourished, the genetic landscape continued to evolve through interaction with neighboring groups. Then, when Sumerian political power declined and was replaced by other empires, the genetic continuity persisted. The Marsh Arabs of 2011, carrying genetic ancestry traceable back to the Sumerian era and beyond, represented an unbroken genetic thread spanning 4,000 years or more. The idea that the Sumerians had simply vanished became untenable in light of this evidence. They hadn't vanished. They had transformed. They had integrated with other populations. They had adopted new languages and new ways of life, but their genetic legacy remained embedded in the region where they had built their civilization. This wasn't unique to the Sumerians. Across the ancient world, from Egypt to the Indus Valley, genetic studies were revealing the same pattern. Ancient civilizations didn't disappear when their empires fell. The people adapted and survived. Their descendants, often unaware of the distant ancestry they carried, lived in the same lands where their ancestors had built the world's first cities. The Sumerian story also revealed something profound about how ancient populations understood themselves. The Sumerians had called themselves the black-headed people. They had a distinctive identity, a language, traditions, and beliefs that set them apart from neighboring groups. When that civilization fell, that distinctive identity faded from the historical record. But the genetic continuity suggested something deeper. Identity could change, empires could fall, but the human lineage persisted. The modern Marsh Arabs of Iraq didn't necessarily know they carried Sumerian ancestry. They had their own identity, their own history, their own way of life. Yet scientifically, their DNA spoke of connections reaching back to the ancient world, to the people who had built the world's first cities and invented writing. Understanding this connection between ancient and modern populations had practical implications too. Researchers could now use ancient DNA not just to satisfy historical curiosity, but to understand how diseases had evolved, how populations had adapted to their environments over millennia, and how human resilience had allowed populations to survive environmental challenges and upheavals. The Sumerians had lived in the challenging environment of the Mesopotamian marshlands. They had developed sophisticated technologies to manage flooding, create irrigation, and transform swamps into farmland. Their descendants, the Marsh Arabs, had continued to live in that same difficult environment for thousands of years after, maintaining many of the same practices. The genetic thread that connected them also suggested an unbroken tradition of adaptation and survival. The viral headline that claimed Sumerian DNA matched no modern population was fundamentally wrong. It misunderstood or deliberately distorted the scientific research. The truth, according to peer-reviewed genetic studies published in prestigious journals by teams from Harvard University and other leading institutions, was the opposite. Sumerian DNA did match modern populations. It matched most clearly in Iraq, particularly among the Marsh Arabs who had maintained residence in the ancient Sumerian heartland. Modern Iraqis, and by extension many people throughout the Middle East, carried genetic ancestry traceable to the Sumerian period. This wasn't something foreign or exotic. It was a straightforward result of population genetics and human migration patterns. When you tested the DNA of modern people living where ancient Sumerians had lived, you found genetic continuity. The broader significance of this discovery extended beyond just the Sumerians. It demonstrated that ancient DNA science was fundamentally changing how we understood human history. For centuries, history had been written based on written records and artifacts. Only civilizations that left written texts or monumental structures received detailed historical attention. But ancient DNA provided a new voice, a biological voice that spoke across thousands of years. It revealed patterns and connections that written history alone could never capture. It showed that populations had survived civilizational changes far more often than historians had assumed. It suggested that human continuity in ancient regions was far deeper than previously thought. It challenged the idea that conquest and replacement were automatic outcomes of civilizational collapse. Instead, it painted a picture of adaptation, integration, and persistence. The story of Sumerian DNA was also a story about the power of science to answer ancient questions. For millennia, people could only speculate about what happened to the Sumerians. They could read what ancient texts said. They could study the ruins of Sumerian cities. But they couldn't know what happened to the people themselves. Modern genetics changed that. By extracting DNA, From ancient remains and comparing it to modern populations, scientists could literally trace human lineages across thousands of years. They could answer questions that had puzzled historians and archaeologists for centuries. They could prove that the Sumerians, despite the fall of their civilization, had not vanished from the earth. Their descendants walked the same marshlands where their ancestors had built Uruk and Ur. When you looked at the full picture, the evidence became overwhelming. The 2011 study showing strong genetic continuity between modern Marsh Arabs and the Sumerian period. The 2022 Harvard research tracing ancient DNA back to the earliest populations in Mesopotamia. The consistent genetic signals pointing to a population that had remained rooted in Mesopotamia through multiple civilizational changes. All of this told a story of remarkable human persistence. The Sumerians hadn't vanished. They had transformed and adapted, but they endured. They were still there in the genetic makeup of modern Middle Eastern populations, in the cultural practices of communities like the Marsh Arabs, and in the legacy of innovations they had left behind that still influenced civilization today. The world's first cities, the first writing system, the first complex legal codes, the first organized trade networks. All of these had emerged from Sumer, and the people who had created them hadn't disappeared. They had evolved, adapted, and their descendants continued to live in Mesopotamia millennia later. This discovery had profound implications for understanding human history more broadly. For centuries, history had been written as a series of conquests and replacements. One civilization fell, another rose. One people were replaced by another, but genetic science suggested a more complex picture. Civilizations rose and fell, empires changed hands, but the people endured. They might adopt new languages, practice new religions, follow new rulers, but they remained. They adapted to new circumstances while maintaining their genetic connection to their ancestors. This pattern wasn't unique to the Sumerians. Similar findings were emerging from studies of ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, and other ancient civilizations. The genetic evidence suggested that human populations were far more resilient and adaptive than traditional history had given them credit for. Conquest often meant integration and mixing, rather than wholesale replacement. For the Marsh Arabs specifically, this genetic discovery had deep significance. Many of them had no idea they carried the ancestry of one of the world's oldest civilizations. They maintained their own modern identity, their own traditions and beliefs. Yet, scientifically, historically, they were connected to the Sumerians who had built Uruk and Ur. Their lifestyle, living in the same marshlands where Sumerians had lived, using similar building methods and fishing techniques, suddenly had a genetic basis. This wasn't just cultural preservation. This was ancestral continuity, literally encoded in their DNA, passed down through thousands of years and countless generations. This was the truth that genetic science had revealed. This was the answer to the ancient question. For thousands of years, people wondered what happened to the Sumerians after their civilization fell. Now we knew. They never truly left. They simply changed, adapted, and continued forward through time, carrying their ancestry through the generations, leaving an unbroken genetic thread that connected the ancient world to the modern world. The mystery had been solved not by deciphering ancient texts or excavating ruins, but by reading the DNA that flowed through the veins of modern populations. The Sumerians were still here. They always had been. Their legacy lived on, not just in the innovations they had created and the cultures they had influenced, but in the very blood of their descendants, who still walked the same lands where their ancestors had built civilization itself.